The wheelchair toppled over, the girl hitting the ground with a stunned gasp. Onlookers froze, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief as Walt Harrington turned on his heel, his jaw clenched. "I've had enough of this," he muttered, his voice cold. Amara's wide eyes filled with something far deeper than pain, fear and confusion, a silent question that cut through the chaos. Why would someone do this to me? And yet, in that moment of shattering cruelty, a flicker of something else began, a ripple that would change everything. Before we dive into the story, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a situation like this? Or perhaps you've faced a moment where standing up for what's right was the only choice? Let us know. Where are you tuning in from today? It's always amazing to see where our stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss heartwarming and inspiring stories about equality, love and compassion on this journey of kindness. Let's jump right into today's story. Brightwater was a town where the past lingered in every corner. Nestled along a rugged stretch of coastline, it was a place where history whispered through weathered cottages and cobblestone streets. The heart of Brightwater was its park, a haven of open green fields, winding paths, and a view that stretched endlessly toward the ocean. It seemed timeless, a snapshot of tranquility. Yet beneath its serene facade lay unspoken tensions, invisible to the untrained eye, but keenly felt by those who called it home. Brightwater's beauty concealed a quiet undercurrent of division, where inclusion was an ideal, not yet a reality. Walt Harrington was once a name that inspired admiration in Brightwater. A firefighter for nearly 3 decades, Walt had been a local hero, a figure of resilience and courage. But time had transformed him into something else entirely. He now lived on the fringes of the community, not because anyone had pushed him there, but because he had chosen to retreat. His house stood on the edge of town, its peeling paint and overgrown lawn a testament to the neglect he no longer cared to fix. Inside, photographs of his late wife and son gathered dust on a mantel above a fireplace that hadn't been lit in years. Walt's eyes, once sharp and full of purpose, now carried a dullness, a weariness that hinted at wounds far deeper than any the world could see. He had suffered losses that would break anyone. The fire that claimed his family had also taken the last pieces of himself. But the fire that defined him most wasn't the one that destroyed his home. Years earlier, in the line of duty, he had responded to a blaze that tore through a small house on the poorer side of Brightwater. The fire was fierce, roaring through the walls as if intent on consuming everything in its path. Inside was a family, a mother and her young son. Walt had fought to save them, braving the flames as he carried the mother to safety. But when he turned back for the boy, the fire had grown too wild. He had tried, but it wasn't enough. By the time they pulled the child's body from the wreckage, the mother's anguished screams had already burned themselves into Walt's memory. "You let him die," she had cried, her voice raw with grief. "You didn't try hard enough." Her words haunted him for years, becoming a refrain that played on an endless loop in his mind. Rationally, he knew he had done everything he could, but guilt was irrational. It had no use for logic. Over time, the memory of that night hardened into bitterness. He stopped seeing the mother as someone grieving and started seeing her as someone ungrateful. That bitterness festered, growing roots in his heart, tangling with his other losses, until it colored the way he saw the world. It wasn't just grief that isolated Walt, it was the resentment that came with it. Brightwater's Park was one of the few places Walt still frequented. It was a sanctuary of sorts, though even that term felt too soft for how he used it. He walked its paths not for pleasure, but out of habit, his steps heavy, his hands often shoved deep in his coat pockets. He avoided eye contact with the joggers and families who shared the space, carving out his own invisible bubble of solitude. It was here, on one such walk that Walt first noticed Amara Bell. Amara was a child of energy and light. At 10 years old, she navigated the world in a wheelchair, her legs rendered immobile by a condition she had known since birth. But what Amara lacked in mobility, she more than made up for in spirit. Her laugh was infectious, her presence magnetic. She often came to the park with her sketch pad and pencils, spending hours capturing the world around her. Waves crashing against the shore, children playing in the grass, seagulls circling above. Her drawings were vivid, alive with detail. For Amara, the park was freedom. It was the one place where the limitations of her body seemed to melt away. That morning, Amara was seated near a cluster of trees, her wheelchair positioned to catch the best view of the ocean. She was drawing a flock of seagulls in mid-flight, her hand moving swiftly but deliberately across the page. The soft hum of the sea breeze was her only soundtrack until she heard the faint crunch of footsteps approaching. She glanced up briefly and saw him, Walt Harrington, the grumpy man everyone in town seemed to know but no one dared approach. Walt stopped a few feet away, his gaze settling on her. For a moment, his hardened exterior cracked. Amara, with her curls catching the sunlight and her face etched in concentration, reminded him of someone. The memory came unbidden. His son, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, carefully piecing together a puzzle. The resemblance was fleeting, but it hit him like a punch to the gut. Before he could linger on the thought, Walt shoved it aside. He wasn't the kind of man who indulged in sentimentality anymore. "Kids these days," he muttered, his voice carrying just enough to be heard. "Always out here drawing attention to themselves." Amara paused, her pencil hovering over the paper. She glanced at him again, her expression calm but curious. "Excuse me?" she asked, her tone more surprised than offended. Walt waved a dismissive hand. "Never mind," he grumbled. He turned to leave but hesitated, as if expecting her to say something else. When she didn't, he scoffed and walked away, his footsteps heavier than before. Amara watched him go, her head tilting slightly in curiosity. She had heard about Walt. How could she not? He was practically a fixture in the town, though not in the way most people aspired to be. But she had never interacted with him before. She shook her head lightly, a small smile tugging at her lips, and returned to her drawing. Whatever his problem was, it wasn't hers to solve. For Walt, the encounter lingered longer than he cared to admit. As he continued his walk, he found his thoughts drifting back to the girl and her sketchpad. He told himself it didn't matter. She didn't matter. But something about her, something about the way she had looked at him, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet confidence, unsettled him. He didn't like being unsettled. He preferred the predictability of his anger, the familiarity of his isolation. And so, in the quiet of Brightwater, two lives brushed past each other, each carrying burdens the other couldn't yet see. For Amara, the moment was a footnote, a passing interaction on an otherwise ordinary day. For Walt, it was a crack in the walls he had spent years building. And though neither of them knew it yet, their stories were about to become irreversibly entwined. Walt Harrington woke to another restless morning. The same ache that had lived in his chest for years greeted him like an old companion, heavy and unwelcome. The day stretched before him, another in a long series of days marked by solitude and a quiet disdain for the world around him. Seeking the rhythm of routine, he donned his coat and ventured toward the park, his steps deliberate but unhurried. The park, with its sweeping views of the ocean and its gentle paths weaving through the greenery, was a place that should have brought peace. But for Walt, it was different now. It wasn't the haven it had once been. Lately, he'd begun to feel that even this space, his space, was slipping away, invaded by strangers and noise. And then there was the girl. As Walt entered the park that morning, his eyes immediately found Amara Bell. She was there again, in the same spot she had occupied the day before, her wheelchair nestled under a shady tree. Her head was bent over her sketch pad, her pencil moving with precision as she captured the world in lines and shapes. Walt's jaw tightened. It wasn't just her presence that irked him, it was what she represented. She didn't belong here, not in his mind. Her quiet determination seemed to mock the bitterness he carried. He lingered for a moment, watching her from a distance. There was a calmness about her that Walt couldn't reconcile. She seemed so at ease, so unaffected by the weight of the world. It was a stark contrast to the storm that churned inside him every day. He told himself that this feeling, this discomfort, was because she was taking up space, disrupting the balance of the park. But deep down, he knew it was something else entirely. Unable to hold back his irritation, Walt approached. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate, as if he were staking a claim with each step. He stopped just a few feet from Amara, his shadow falling across her page. She didn't look up right away, seemingly unfazed by his looming presence. Finally, she glanced at him, her gaze steady and unflinching. "You think sitting here all day is going to make people feel sorry for you?" Walt's tone was sharp, his words cutting through the morning air like shards of glass. Amara paused, her pencil hovering above the paper. For a moment she studied him, her young face unreadable. Then, in a voice as steady as her gaze, she replied, "I don't need anyone's pity. I'm here to draw." Her calm demeanor only fueled Walt's frustration. He was used to people reacting with awkwardness or defensiveness, but this girl wasn't giving him either. She wasn't cowering or backing down. It made him feel exposed, as though she could see through the walls he had so carefully built. "Well, don't turn this park into your stage," he snapped, his voice rising. "People don't come here to watch you make a spectacle of yourself." Amara straightened slightly in her wheelchair, setting her sketchpad down on her lap. Her voice remained steady, almost unnervingly so. "If you don't like it," she said, her words deliberate, "you can walk somewhere else." Her response felt like a challenge, one Walt wasn't prepared to meet. His chest tightened, anger bubbling to the surface. He couldn't explain why this girl, of all people, had gotten under his skin. She wasn't loud or disruptive. She hadn't done anything to him, and yet her very existence seemed to poke at the raw edges of his pain. Before he could stop himself, Walt lashed out, not with words, but with an act of anger that startled even him. He kicked at the side of her wheelchair, the force of it enough to tip it over. Amara cried out as she tumbled to the ground, her sketchpad and pencils scattering across the grass. The world seemed to pause. A group of passers-by stopped, their murmurs of shock hanging in the air. But no one moved. No one stepped forward to intervene. Amara lay there for a moment, stunned. Her wide eyes met Walt's, and for the first time he saw something other than defiance in her gaze. It was fear. The sight of it unsettled him. He wanted to look away, to leave, to pretend this hadn't happened. But before he could act on the impulse, a voice cut through the tension. "What the hell are you doing?" Walt turned to see a young man approaching, his phone held up as if capturing the scene. The man, Evan Brooks, was a college student, tall and wiry, with a sharpness in his eyes that made it clear he wasn't afraid to confront Walt. "You think this is okay?" Evan continued, his voice incredulous. "Knocking over a kid in a wheelchair? What's wrong with you?" Walt's expression darkened. He didn't answer, didn't offer any justification. Instead, he shot Evan a glare that was equal parts anger and disdain, then turned and walked away without a word. His retreat was slow, deliberate, as if to show he wasn't running, even though part of him wanted to escape. As Walt disappeared down the path, Evan turned his attention to Amara. He knelt beside her, carefully helping her upright and checking to make sure she wasn't hurt. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. Amara nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she gathered her scattered pencils. She avoided meeting his eyes, her focus on steadying herself. "Listen," Evan said gently. "I'm going to post this. People need to see what just happened. Someone like him shouldn't get away with this." Amara hesitated, then gave a small nod. She didn't say anything, but her silence spoke volumes. She didn't want attention, didn't want to be at the center of this kind of incident. But she also knew this wasn't just about her. A woman from the crowd finally stepped forward, an older lady with kind eyes. She helped adjust Amara's wheelchair, offering a reassuring pat on her shoulder. "You're a brave girl," the woman said softly. Amara managed a faint smile, but her eyes remained distant. As Evan stood and began walking away, phone in hand, she turned back to her sketchpad. It was bent and smudged, but salvageable. She placed it carefully on her lap, her fingers brushing over the half-finished drawing of the seagulls. Her pencil moved again, slow at first, then more steadily. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Her strength was in her silence, in her refusal to let this moment define her. As the park resumed its usual hum of life, the echoes of what had just transpired lingered like a shadow. And for Walt, though he wouldn't admit it yet, the shadow was beginning to follow him too. Evan Brooks sat in his small apartment, staring at the video on his phone. He had watched it several times now, each viewing igniting the same blend of anger and disbelief. Amara's tumble from her wheelchair, the scattered sketchpad and pencils, the look of fear on her face. It was all seared into his mind. The man responsible, Walt Harrington, had walked away without a shred of remorse, and the silence from the onlookers in the park had only made it worse. Evan knew he couldn't let it go unnoticed. With a deep breath, he tapped the screen to upload the footage to his social media account. His caption was brief, but pointed. "Heartbreaking to witness this. The park doesn't belong to one person. Brightwater can do better." Within hours, the video began to gain traction. Comments flooded in, ranging from outrage to disbelief. Strangers from far beyond Brightwater shared their thoughts, many expressing support for Amara and disgust at the incident. "This is horrifying," one user wrote. "That poor girl didn't deserve this." Another added, "Why isn't anyone stepping in? Why are people just watching?" The footage seemed to tap into a universal frustration with injustice, and it wasn't long before the video had amassed thousands of views and shares. But the reactions weren't entirely one-sided. A small but vocal group began to defend Walt, insisting the video lacked context. "We don't know what happened before this," one commenter argued. "Maybe he was provoked." Another chimed in, "People snap under pressure. Don't ruin someone's life over a bad moment." The video, now viral, had become a lightning rod for debate, dividing not just strangers on the internet, but the close-knit community of Brightwater itself. For Walt, the fallout was swift and suffocating. At first, he was oblivious to the storm brewing online. He didn't use social media, didn't see the video or read the comments. But the effects reached him all the same. He began receiving phone calls, some silent, others filled with threats and accusations. His mailbox overflowed with letters, some scrawled with words of support, but most condemning him. When he ventured into town, he noticed the change immediately. Neighbors who once offered polite nods now avoided his gaze. The woman at the corner store, who used to exchange pleasantries as she rang up his groceries, barely spoke to him, her eyes darting to the newspaper headline on the counter. "Local incident sparks outrage. Man's actions toward disabled child go viral." At first, Walt was defiant. He muttered under his breath about people overreacting, about the world growing soft. "I didn't do anything wrong," he told himself over and over. "I just wanted some peace and quiet." But the isolation gnawed at him, and the angry words from strangers echoed in his mind long after the calls ended. His once familiar world felt foreign and hostile, and for all his bravado, he couldn't shake the creeping sense of shame. Meanwhile, Sophia Bell found herself grappling with a storm of her own. The video had thrust her daughter into the public eye, and while much of the attention was supportive, it was overwhelming nonetheless. Amara was her priority, and protecting her from the fallout was paramount. But Sophia knew she couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just about Amara. It was about standing against the kind of behavior that had hurt her child and could hurt others. When a local journalist reached out for an interview, Sophia hesitated. She wasn't one for public speaking, but the anger she felt on behalf of her daughter propelled her forward. At the small press conference held outside Brightwater's community center, Sophia spoke with calm determination. "My daughter didn't deserve this," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "No one does. This isn't just about Amara, it's about how we treat each other as human beings. Brightwater should be a place where everyone feels safe, where everyone belongs." Her words struck a chord, and soon organizations advocating for children's rights and social justice began to rally behind her. They shared the video, amplifying its reach, and called for accountability. "This is unacceptable," one group tweeted. "We stand with Amara and all children who deserve respect and dignity." But the attention wasn't without its challenges. Sophia received her share of criticism, with some accusing her of seeking publicity or exaggerating the incident. "Why drag this out?" one anonymous email read. "Kids are resilient. Move on." The words stung, but Sophia stood firm. She wasn't fighting for attention. She was fighting for her daughter's right to exist in a world that treated her with fairness. Evan, too, found himself under fire. While many praised his decision to film and share the video, others accused him of escalating the situation unnecessarily. Some of the criticism came from people in Brightwater who resented what they saw as a smear on their community. "You're just making things worse," one man shouted at him in the grocery store parking lot. "Putting people's dirty laundry online, how does that help?" Evan was resolute. "I didn't post the video to hurt anyone," he explained in an online statement. "I posted it because staying silent allows things like this to keep happening. If calling it out makes people uncomfortable, maybe that's what needs to happen." Through it all, Amara remained quiet. She continued to visit the park, though she was more cautious now, sticking to areas where others were close by. Her sketches became even more detailed, as if the act of drawing allowed her to process what had happened. One afternoon, as she worked on a piece depicting the park's ocean view, a little boy approached her. "Are you the girl from the video?" he asked, his wide eyes full of curiosity. Amara hesitated, then nodded. "You're really brave," the boy said, before running off to join his friends. The comment stayed with her, filling her with both pride and discomfort. She didn't feel brave. She hadn't chosen to be at the center of this. But if people were looking at her, then maybe she could use the attention for something good. Brightwater was no longer the quiet town it had been just days before. The video had cast a spotlight on its imperfections, forcing its residents to confront uncomfortable truths. For Walt, Sophia, Amara, and Evan, the storm was far from over. But amidst the chaos, seeds of change were being sown. The question now was whether they would take root, or whether the town would let them be swept away. The courtroom was filled with an air of quiet tension, the kind that makes every whispered word and shuffled footstep feel amplified. Sophia Bell sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her resolve was as firm as it had ever been, but the weight of what she was about to face lingered in the pit of her stomach. To her left sat Amara, silent and composed, though her fingers toyed nervously with the hem of her dress. Sophia reached over and placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's arm. "We're doing the right thing," she whispered. Amara turned to her, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "But what if this just makes everything worse, Mom?" Amara's voice was soft, almost hesitant, and it tugged at Sophia's heart. "It won't," Sophia replied firmly. "This isn't just about us. It's about making sure people understand that what happened to you isn't okay. Not for you, not for anyone." Her voice was steady, but inside, Sophia was acutely aware of the risks she was taking. Filing the lawsuit had not been an easy decision. Friends and neighbors had urged her to let it go, to avoid stirring the pot. But Sophia knew in her soul that silence wasn't an option. This was about standing up for her daughter and for others like her who couldn't always fight back. When the door at the back of the courtroom opened, heads turned. Walt Harrington entered, his presence heavy with defiance. He wore a dark suit that looked slightly ill-fitted, as though it hadn't been worn in years. His expression was impassive, his eyes fixed forward, avoiding the curious glances of those already seated. He walked with purpose to the defendant's table, his lawyer trailing slightly behind him, and sat down without a word. Sophia felt a pang of anger as she watched him. How could someone so cold, so unapologetic, sit there as though he had done nothing wrong? The proceedings began with formalities, the judge outlining the charges against Walt, assault and emotional harm inflicted on a minor. As the words echoed through the courtroom, Walt's face remained stoic, his gaze steady. He didn't look at Sophia, nor at Amara, and certainly not at the people sitting in the rows behind them. His detachment made it easy for him to dismiss the seriousness of the accusations, even as Sophia's lawyer laid out the facts with clinical precision. When Walt was asked to respond, his voice was calm, almost dismissive. "I didn't hurt her," he said flatly. "She wasn't even injured. This whole thing has been blown out of proportion." He leaned back slightly in his chair, as though the weight of the proceedings was more of an inconvenience than a reckoning. "That kid. She just wants attention. She's trying to make everyone feel sorry for her." The words hung in the air like a slap. Sophia's breath caught, her fists clenching beneath the table. Amara's head dropped slightly, her hands stilling on her lap. Sophia's lawyer stood quickly, addressing the judge with practiced composure. "Your Honor," she began, "this case isn't about pity, it's about respect. What Mr. Harrington did was not only harmful, but emblematic of a deeper issue, a refusal to see others as deserving of dignity." Sophia felt a surge of pride as her lawyer spoke, but it wasn't enough to quell the frustration building inside her. She couldn't remain silent. When given the opportunity to speak, she rose, steadying herself with a deep breath. "No one is asking for pity," she said, her voice firm yet carrying the weight of her emotions. "All my daughter has ever wanted is to be treated like anyone else. What Mr. Harrington did wasn't just an act of anger. It was a refusal to see her as an equal, as someone with value. Respect isn't optional. It's the bare minimum we owe each other." Her words drew murmurs of agreement from the audience, but Walt's expression barely flickered. He stared ahead, his jaw set, as though he were bracing himself against her words rather than absorbing them. The tension in the room deepened as Evan Brooks was called to the stand. The young man walked to the witness chair with a quiet confidence, his phone tucked into his pocket. As he was sworn in, his gaze briefly met Amara's, and he offered her a small nod of encouragement. "I was in the park that day," Evan began. "I saw everything. Mr. Harrington approached Amara while she was drawing. He started yelling at her, accusing her of being a nuisance, of wanting attention, and then he kicked her wheelchair. She fell to the ground. I couldn't believe what I was seeing." The lawyer for Walt interjected, attempting to undermine Evan's credibility. "And what made you think it was appropriate to film the incident?" he asked, his tone sharp. Evan didn't falter. I filmed it because I couldn't stand by and do nothing. If I hadn't recorded it, people might not have believed what happened. This wasn't just about one moment of anger. It was about how easy it is for people to ignore someone they think doesn't matter. His words carried through the courtroom, leaving a profound silence in their wake. Even the judge seemed to pause, letting the weight of the testimony settle before moving on. Walt shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes briefly darting toward Amara before quickly looking away. When the time came for the judge to deliver the ruling, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Walt Harrington was ordered to complete 200 hours of community service at Seaside Care, a local center for children with disabilities. He was also required to pay restitution to the Bell family for emotional distress. The sentence was measured, but it carried a message. Accountability was non-negotiable. As the decision was read aloud, Walt's face remained expressionless. Yet, when he glanced toward Amara, something in his gaze softened, just for a moment. Amara met his eyes, her expression a mix of sadness and strength. She didn't look away. Walt broke the connection first, his jaw tightening as he turned back to the judge. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Sophia, their questions rapid and unrelenting. "How do you feel about the verdict?" one asked. "Do you think justice was served?" Sophia held Amara close as she responded. "This isn't just about justice for Amara," she said. "It's about creating a community where everyone is treated with dignity. That's all we want." Walt left the courthouse alone, his shoulders hunched as he walked to his car. For the first time, the weight of his actions felt heavier than the anger he clung to. The verdict wasn't just a punishment, it was a mirror, forcing him to confront the man he had become. Whether he liked it or not, his journey was just beginning. Walt Harrington stepped into Seaside Care with the reluctance of a man being dragged toward his own reckoning. The air inside the center was warm, tinged with the faint scent of paint and cleaning solution. It was a world so different from the one he had carved out for himself. Too bright, too full of life. The sounds of children laughing, the occasional shout or squeal, grated against his nerves like nails on a chalkboard. He wanted to turn around, to walk out the way he had come. But the weight of the court's decision hung heavy on his shoulders, and he knew he couldn't escape this. Standing near the entrance was Elena Morales, the center's manager. She was a petite woman with dark, wavy hair pulled into a loose ponytail and a kind but no-nonsense demeanor. Her warm brown eyes assessed Walt as he approached, and she extended her hand in greeting. "Mr. Harrington, welcome to Seaside Care," she said with a measured smile. "We're glad to have your help." Walt hesitated before shaking her hand, his grip firm but perfunctory. "Let's just get this over with," he muttered, his voice gruff. Eleanor didn't flinch at his tone. She had worked with all kinds of people, parents at their wits' end, children struggling to find their way, volunteers who came with all the enthusiasm in the world and some who had none at all. Walt, with his closed-off demeanor and reluctant presence, was just another challenge. "This way," she said, leading him down a corridor lined with colorful artwork. "I'll introduce you to the team." As they entered the main activity room, Walt's eyes scanned the space. The walls were decorated with bright murals depicting oceans and skies, and the room was alive with movement. Children of various ages and abilities were engaged in different activities, some painting, others building towers with blocks, and a few simply watching the commotion with quiet interest. Walt's jaw tightened as he took it all in. The scene was too loud, too chaotic, and the children, their presence made something in him tighten uncomfortably. "Everyone, this is Mr. Harrington," Eleanor announced, her voice cutting through the din. "He'll be helping us out for a while." A few staff members looked up from their tasks, offering polite nods or brief waves. Walt didn't respond. He kept his eyes down, avoiding their gazes. Eleanor didn't push for more. Instead, she began explaining his duties, maintenance tasks, assisting with setup and cleanup for activities, and anything else that might be needed. Walt barely listened. His focus kept drifting to the children, their laughter and chatter, a constant undercurrent that he couldn't seem to block out. It was during his first break that he met Jaden. The boy rolled toward him in a wheelchair, a mischievous grin lighting up his face. Jaden was 13, with dark curls and a spark in his eyes that hinted at a quick wit and boundless curiosity. "Hey there," Jaden greeted him, his tone cheerful and unassuming. "You must be the new guy. I'm Jaden." Walt glanced at him briefly, offering a curt nod. "Yeah," he replied, his voice flat. Jaden didn't seem deterred by Walt's lack of enthusiasm. "So, what brings you here? Community service? Volunteering? Court order?" The last option hit too close to home, and Walt's face hardened. "Just here to do my time," he said, his tone clipped. Jaden tilted his head, studying Walt for a moment. "Well, whatever the reason, welcome. Hope you survived the chaos." He gave a small laugh before wheeling away, leaving Walt with a faint sense of unease. The boy's friendliness had been genuine, but it felt like a spotlight shining on the parts of Walt he'd rather keep hidden. The rest of the day passed slowly. Walt moved through his tasks with the mechanical efficiency of someone determined not to engage more than necessary. But he couldn't ignore what he saw. A young girl with autism had a meltdown during a group activity, her cries piercing the room. Walt watched as a staff member knelt beside her, speaking softly, gently guiding her to a quiet corner until she calmed down. The patience and care on display unsettled him. It was a stark contrast to the world he had known, a world where problems were met with sharp words and quick fixes. That evening, as the center emptied out, Walt gathered his things and prepared to leave early. He had finished what he considered his share of the work and saw no reason to linger. But as he reached the door, a familiar voice stopped him. "Leaving already?" Jaden's tone was light, but there was a hint of challenge beneath it. Walt turned to see the boy watching him from across the room. "What's it to you?" he asked, his voice laced with irritation. Jaden wheeled closer, his expression calm but unyielding. "I just figured you'd stick around, maybe help out a bit more, but I guess I was wrong." Walt bristled. "You don't know anything about me, kid. Don't act like you do." Jaden didn't back down. "I don't need to know you to know that everyone can do better if they want to. Even you." The words hit Walt harder than he expected. He wanted to argue, to dismiss the boy's statement as naive. But something in Jaden's tone, an unwavering belief that people could change, stayed with him as he walked out the door. That night, sleep didn't come easily. When it finally did, it brought with it the dreams he had spent years trying to outrun. The fire was always the same, hot, consuming, unrelenting. He saw the house engulfed in flames, heard the screams of the mother he had saved, and felt the crushing weight of his failure to save her son. In the dream, the boy's face blurred, morphing into other faces, until it became his own son's. Walt woke with a start, his chest heaving, his shirt soaked with sweat. He sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands, as the echoes of the dream lingered. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to question. Was the anger he carried worth it? Was it protecting him from the pain, or was it feeding it? He didn't have answers, but the questions themselves were enough to unsettle him. As he stared out the window at the darkened sky, Walt felt the faintest shift, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The morning sun bathed the courtyard of Seaside Care in golden light, warming the pavement and casting soft shadows on the tables arranged for the day's activity. It was a special event, an outdoor painting session for the children. Staff members bustled about, setting up easels and arranging paints, while the children eagerly chatted about what they planned to create. Walt Harrington stood to the side, a reluctant participant in the preparations. His task was straightforward: organize supplies, help set up chairs, and assist the children who used wheelchairs to move outside. Simple enough, yet every part of it felt like an intrusion on the solitary existence he preferred. As he carried a box of paint jars to a table, he kept his head down, avoiding conversation. The voices around him seemed distant, muffled by his determination to remain detached. Still, he couldn't completely block out the bursts of laughter or the excited chatter of the children. It gnawed at him, stirring emotions he didn't want to acknowledge. Walt was arranging paintbrushes when he heard Elena Morales' voice nearby. "Walt, could you help Jaden and a couple of the others get settled outside?" she asked, her tone polite but firm. Without waiting for his response, she gestured toward a group of children waiting at the entrance. He gave a brief nod, walking over to push Jaden's wheelchair. The boy grinned at him, his easy demeanor a sharp contrast to Walt's discomfort. "Big day, huh?" Jaden said as Walt maneuvered him toward a table. "You ever paint, Mr. Harrington?" "Not my thing," Walt muttered, his eyes fixed ahead. Jaden tilted his head back to look at Walt, his grin undiminished. "Well, there's a first time for everything." Walt didn't respond. He helped Jaden settle into place, adjusted the wheels, and quickly turned to leave, eager to escape the interaction. But as the courtyard filled with children and parents, retreat became impossible. And then he saw her. Amara Bell, sitting quietly in her wheelchair, sketchpad balanced on her lap, was a figure Walt hadn't expected to see. Her mother, Sophia, stood nearby, speaking with Elena. For a moment, Walt froze. His eyes darted to Amara, who met his gaze briefly before lowering her head to begin sketching. She hadn't said a word, hadn't acknowledged him in any way beyond that fleeting glance. Yet her presence unsettled him. He busied himself with small tasks, keeping a wary distance. But his resolve to avoid her crumbled when, during a break in activity, he glanced toward her table and saw the sketch she was working on. From where he stood, the details were blurry, but the shapes were unmistakable. Waves rolling onto a beach, gulls soaring overhead, the horizon stretching endlessly beyond. Something about the image pulled at him, a faint but insistent tug in the depths of his chest. Compelled by an impulse he didn't understand, Walt moved closer. He stopped a few feet away, just within view of the page. Up close, the drawing was even more striking. The lines were delicate but sure, capturing the motion of the sea and the freedom of the birds in flight. The scene felt achingly familiar. Memories he had spent years trying to bury came flooding back. Afternoons spent on the beach with his wife, their laughter mingling with the sound of the waves. He could almost hear her voice again, calm and steady, as she spoke words he hadn't thought of in years. "If we can't change the world, Walt, maybe we can let it change us." Walt blinked, his throat tightening. He stared at Amara's drawing, his breath catching as emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years bubbled to the surface. It wasn't just the memory of his wife that struck him. It was the realization that the girl in front of him, the one he had wronged so deeply, carried the same quiet resilience, the same ability to see beauty in a world that had shown her pain. For the first time in what felt like forever, tears welled in Walt's eyes. He turned away quickly, brushing a hand across his face, but it was too late. Elena had seen him. "Walt," she said softly, her voice pulling him back to the present. She approached, her expression gentle but curious. "Are you okay?" He didn't answer right away. His hands trembled slightly as he folded them together, his gaze fixed on the ground. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "I've lost everything," he admitted. And the worst part is, I've spent all these years making sure I lose even more. Eleanor studied him for a moment before responding. Loss has a way of doing that, she said. It convinces us to hold on to the pain because it's all we think we have left. But the truth is, holding on doesn't bring them back. It just keeps us stuck. Her words were simple, but they struck a chord deep within him. Walt nodded slightly, though he didn't look up. I don't know if I can change, he said quietly. Elena smiled faintly. Change doesn't happen all at once. It starts with small steps, like staying a little longer than you planned, like noticing a drawing. Walt didn't reply, but her words stayed with him. As the session wound down and the children began to leave, he found himself lingering. He moved quietly, picking up discarded brushes and wiping down tables. It was a small act, almost invisible, but it felt significant. He wasn't sure why he was doing it, only that it felt like something he needed to do. From across the courtyard, Jaden watched him. The boy didn't say anything, but his knowing smile spoke volumes. Walt caught his eye briefly, then turned back to his work, a faint sense of peace settling over him for the first time in years. That night, Walt lay awake in his small, dimly lit room. The day's events replayed in his mind, the children's laughter, the warmth of the sun, the sight of Amara's drawing. He thought of his wife's words again, the ones he had dismissed for so long. Let the world change you. As he stared at the ceiling, the tears came again, quiet but unrelenting. They weren't just tears of sadness, they were tears of release, of something old and heavy beginning to loosen its grip. Walt didn't know what would come next, but for the first time he felt a glimmer of possibility. The cracks in his walls were widening, and through them, light was beginning to seep in. The workbench in the corner of Seaside Care's workshop had seen better days, its surface worn smooth by years of use. Walt Harrington stood over it, his hands steady as he adjusted a wrench on the axle of a wheelchair. It had been years since he'd used his hands for something so intricate. The last time he'd applied himself like this, he had been a firefighter, using his skills to save lives. Now, his work was quieter, less urgent, but no less meaningful. Each bolt tightened, each wheel aligned, carried a weight of intention that Walt hadn't felt in a long time. Jaden sat nearby, observing with a mix of amusement and curiosity. You know, he said, his tone light, for someone who's supposed to be grumpy all the time, you're pretty good at this. Walt gave him a sidelong glance but didn't respond immediately. Jaden wasn't wrong. He had surprised even himself with how easily the old skills returned. Mechanical work had always been second nature to him, something about the precision and focus, calming in a way he hadn't appreciated until now. I've done a thing or two in my life, Walt replied gruffly, though the faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Jaden leaned back in his wheelchair, crossing his arms with an exaggerated air of contemplation. Well, color me impressed. Maybe you've got more tricks up your sleeve than I thought. The wheelchair Walt was working on wasn't just any wheelchair, it was a gift. Over the past week, he had poured himself into building it for Amara. Every piece had been chosen carefully, every adjustment made with care. It wasn't just about fixing what had been broken, it was about creating something new, something better. The project had become a quiet obsession, a way for Walt to channel the complex emotions he was still grappling with. He didn't know if Amara would accept it, but the act of building it felt like a step toward making amends. By the time the wheelchair was finished, Walt felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of accomplishment. It was sleek and sturdy, with subtle details that made it unique. Jaden wheeled over to inspect it, running his hands along the frame. This is legit, he said, nodding approvingly. Amara's gonna love it. Walt didn't respond, but the weight in his chest felt a little lighter. The following evening, Walt stood on the porch of the Bell family's modest home, the wheelchair beside him and a rolled-up canvas tucked under one arm. His heart pounded as he raised his hand to knock. This wasn't the kind of bravery he was used to. Facing a fire was one thing, but confronting the consequences of his own actions was an entirely different battle. Sophia Bell answered the door, her expression cautious but composed. She regarded Walt for a moment, her eyes flicking to the wheelchair and then back to him. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her tone polite but guarded. Walt cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. I wanted to bring this for Amara," he said, gesturing to the wheelchair. "And, this too." He held out the canvas, unrolling it slightly to reveal a painting of the ocean. The scene was simple but vivid. Waves crashing against the shore, gulls in flight, the horizon stretching infinitely. It was a memory brought to life, one that he had carried with him for years, but had never dared to share. Sophia stepped aside, allowing him into the small living room where Amara sat in her old wheelchair. Her sketchpad lay open on her lap, a half-finished drawing of the park filling the page. When she saw Walt, her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't say anything. Walt placed the new wheelchair in front of her, his movements careful. "I know this doesn't make up for what I did," he began, his voice low and steady. "But I wanted to try to do something right." Amara's gaze shifted from the wheelchair to the painting, her expression unreadable. She ran her fingers lightly over the edge of the canvas, tracing the lines of the waves. "You painted this?" she asked softly. Walt nodded. "It reminded me of someone important, someone who used to tell me that if we can't change the world, we should let the world change us." Sophia watched the exchange silently, her arms crossed. Finally she spoke, her tone firm but not unkind. "It's a beautiful gesture, Mr. Harrington, but forgiveness isn't something you can buy with gifts. It has to come from consistent actions, from proving that you've changed." "I know," Walt replied, meeting her gaze. "And I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted to start somewhere." Amara, who had been quiet until then, spoke up. Her voice was soft but clear. "I forgive you," she said, looking directly at Walt, "but only if you promise not to hurt anyone else." Walt's throat tightened and he nodded. "I promise," he said, his voice rough with emotion. The moment hung in the air, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Sophia nodded, her expression softening slightly. "We'll see," she said, her tone carrying both caution and hope. After that night, something shifted in Walt. Back at Seaside Care, he threw himself into his work with a newfound determination. He repaired broken equipment, helped set up activities, and even began teaching the children small woodworking projects. Jaden often hovered nearby, offering commentary that ranged from sarcastic to surprisingly insightful. "You know," Jaden said one afternoon as they worked on a birdhouse together, "I think you're starting to figure it out." "Figure what out?" Walt asked, raising an eyebrow. "How to be the guy you're supposed to be," Jaden replied with a grin. "The one who actually gives a damn." Walt shook his head, but he couldn't help the small smile that crept onto his face. The boy had a way of cutting through his defenses, and for once, Walt didn't mind. Day by day, he began to see the impact of his efforts. The children at the center grew more comfortable around him, greeting him with smiles and waving as he passed. The staff, too, started to treat him less like a reluctant obligation and more like a valued member of the team. And though he knew he still had a long way to go, Walt began to feel a sense of belonging that he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't about erasing the past. He knew that wasn't possible. But for the first time, he felt like he was building something new, something that mattered. And in that quiet, steady work, he found a kind of redemption he hadn't thought he deserved. The air inside the Brightwater Community Center was thick with tension, the kind that seemed to amplify every creak of a chair and shuffle of feet. The room was packed. Residents of all ages had gathered, their faces a mixture of curiosity, anger, and quiet contemplation. Conversations buzzed in low murmurs, but the atmosphere was far from casual. This wasn't a typical town meeting. The focus of tonight's gathering, seated stiffly in the front row, was Walt Harrington. Walt felt the weight of every gaze on him, sharp as needles. He sat with his hands clasped in his lap, his knuckles white from the pressure. The walls around him were lined with framed photos of past community events, smiling faces frozen in time, a stark contrast to the unease in the room now. He had walked into this meeting knowing it would be an uphill battle, knowing he would have to confront a lifetime of mistakes in front of the very people he had alienated. Yet the magnitude of the moment still left him unsteady. The meeting began with formalities. The town council leader, an older woman named Margaret Langston, called the room to order. "We're here tonight to discuss concerns brought forward by members of our community," she said, her voice measured. "Specifically, the participation of Mr. Harrington in public activities, given his history and recent actions." From the back of the room, a man's voice broke through the quiet. "Why are we even talking about this?" he said, his tone cutting. "The guy's a menace. He shouldn't be allowed to represent Brightwater in any way." Murmurs of agreement rippled through one side of the room, while others frowned in disapproval of the outburst. Margaret raised a hand for silence. "Let's maintain order," she said firmly. "Everyone will have a chance to speak." A woman stood up next, her arms crossed tightly. "He spent years tearing people down," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've lived next door to him for over a decade, and he's never once shown an ounce of kindness. And now we're supposed to believe he's changed." Her words were followed by a chorus of whispers, some in agreement, others in quiet protest. Walt felt the sting of each accusation. He had expected hostility, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a blow. Another voice rose from the crowd, this one softer, but no less firm. "We all saw what he did to that little girl," the speaker said, referring to Amara. "And let's not forget the things he said in the past. His words hurt people too. Actions like that don't just disappear." The accusations mounted, each one a reminder of how far he had fallen in the eyes of his community. Walt sat frozen, his gaze fixed on the floor. For a moment he wondered if standing up was even worth it. What could he possibly say that would make a difference to people who had already made up their minds? But then he thought of Amara, of the way she had looked at him with forgiveness he hadn't deserved. He thought of Jaden, of Elena, of the quiet moments at Seaside Care where he had started to feel like he could be someone better. And so, he stood. The room quieted almost instantly, the weight of expectation bearing down on him. Walt cleared his throat, his voice rough from disuse. "I know what you all think of me," he began, his tone steady despite the trembling in his hands. "And I don't blame you." He paused, letting the words settle. "I've hurt people," he continued, "and there's nothing I can say tonight that will undo that. I've been angry for a long time, angry at the world, at myself. And in that anger, I became someone I didn't recognize. I pushed people away. I let bitterness take over. And yes, I made mistakes. Big ones." He looked around the room, meeting as many eyes as he could. "I lost my son in a fire years ago. He was my world. And after that, I didn't know how to deal with the pain. I let it consume me. I blamed everyone else for what I lost, even when it wasn't their fault. Especially when it wasn't their fault." The room was silent now, the tension replaced by something heavier, reflection. Walt took a deep breath, the weight of his confession pressing on him. There was another fire, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Before I lost my son. A little boy didn't make it. I tried to save him, but I couldn't. His mother, she looked at me like I was the reason he didn't come out alive. And for a long time, I believed her. He hesitated, his hands trembling. I let that failure define me. I let it turn me into someone who saw the worst in people, who expected the worst. But I don't want to be that person anymore. I can't be that person anymore. The vulnerability in his words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. I know it's not enough to say I'm sorry, Walt continued, and I know some of you might never forgive me, but I'm here tonight to say that I'm trying. I've spent years letting pain and fear control me. I don't want to live like that anymore. I'm here to ask for a chance to do better. His voice faltered as he finished, but he stood tall, meeting the room's collective gaze with quiet determination. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the side of the room, Evan Brooks stood up. The young man's expression was thoughtful as he addressed the crowd. I filmed the video that started all of this, he said. And I'll be honest, I was angry. What Mr. Harrington did to Amara was wrong. But since then, I've seen him at Seaside Care. I've seen him helping those kids, putting in the time and effort to make things right. He didn't have to do that. No one made him. He chose to. Evan turned toward Walt, nodding slightly. I believe people can change, he said, but only if we let them. The murmurs started again, but this time they were softer, less certain. And then, from the back of the room, a small voice broke through. I don't want anyone else to get hurt, Amara said, her words carrying despite their softness. The crowd parted as she walked forward, her mother at her side. Amara's eyes met Walt's, steady and unwavering. But I believe you can change, she said, and I think everyone deserves a chance. Her words seemed to shift something in the room. The tension eased, replaced by a sense of quiet introspection. People exchanged glances, their expressions thoughtful. Walt felt a lump rise in his throat as he looked at Amara, her forgiveness shining brighter than anything he thought he deserved. Margaret Langston cleared her throat, her voice breaking the silence. It seems we have a lot to think about, she said, but I believe we've heard enough for tonight. As the meeting adjourned, Walt remained where he stood, his heart heavy but hopeful. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt like it was one he could walk. Not alone, but alongside a community he was slowly learning to rebuild trust with, one small step at a time. The halls of Seaside Care buzzed with activity as final preparations for the art exhibition began. Children darted between easels, their laughter filling the air, while staff members carefully arranged the paintings that would soon transform the space into a gallery. The upcoming event was meant to showcase the talent of the children at the center while raising funds and awareness for their programs. For weeks, anticipation had been building, and now the day was finally here. In the corner of the main room, Walt Harrington stood by himself, methodically unboxing supplies. His role was simple: assist with setting up the displays and ensure the children had everything they needed. Yet the weight of the occasion pressed on him. The exhibition wasn't just about art. It was a step into the spotlight, a test of whether he could face the people of Brightwater after everything that had happened. He glanced around the room, his unease growing. Elena Morales appeared at his side, her presence steady and calming. "You're doing fine, Walt," she said softly, sensing his hesitation. "Everything's coming together because of your help." Walt gave a small grunt of acknowledgement but didn't look at her. "Doesn't mean people want me here," he muttered. Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice firm but kind. "You've worked hard for this. You've shown everyone at this center the kind of person you can be. Now's your chance to show the rest of the community." Jaden wheeled over, a playful grin on his face. "Yeah, come on, Mr. Harrington," he chimed in. "You're practically the MVP of this whole thing. Don't back out now." Walt exhaled deeply, the corners of his mouth twitching into the faintest hint of a smile. All right, he said. "Let's just get this over with." As the exhibition began, the atmosphere shifted. Families and townspeople filtered into the center, their conversations creating a soft hum of excitement. The walls were adorned with the children's artwork, vibrant and full of life. Each piece told a story of dreams, resilience, and boundless imagination. Walt stayed near the back, quietly ensuring everything ran smoothly. His presence didn't go unnoticed. Some attendees glanced at him with guarded expressions, their skepticism evident. Others avoided him altogether, their disdain lingering in the air. Walt pretended not to notice, focusing instead on rearranging a stand that had wobbled out of place. Despite his efforts to remain inconspicuous, the tension clung to him like a second skin. The exhibition continued, and gradually the mood began to soften. Parents praised their children's work, their voices filled with pride. A group of kids gathered around Jaden as he explained his painting, gesturing animatedly with his hands. Even the most doubtful visitors couldn't help but smile at the joy radiating from the young artists. Still, Walt felt like an outsider, lingering on the edges of a world he wasn't sure he belonged to. Then came the moment that would change everything. Amara Bell, dressed in a bright yellow dress that mirrored her sunny disposition, took the stage. The room fell silent as she adjusted the microphone, her small hands gripping it tightly. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the crowd before taking a deep breath. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice steady but soft. "My name is Amara Bell, and I'm one of the kids who gets to come to Seaside Care. This place means a lot to me because it's somewhere I can feel safe and be myself." She paused, her gaze briefly settling on Walt. "A little while ago, I didn't feel safe. Something happened that made me scared, and it hurt a lot. But I've learned something since then." The audience leaned in, her words drawing them closer. "I've learned that people can change. Even if they make mistakes, even if they hurt you, they can choose to be better. And when they do, we should give them the chance to show it." She turned fully toward Walt, her smile soft but unwavering. "I used to be scared of Mr. Harrington, but now I see how hard he's worked to make things right. I believe he's changed, and I hope everyone here can believe it too." The room was silent for a beat, her words settling over the crowd like a gentle wave. Then, slowly, the applause began. It started with a few claps, hesitant but genuine, before spreading through the room. Faces that had been skeptical softened, and for the first time that night, Walt felt the weight on his chest begin to lift. One of the townspeople, a man who had been particularly vocal in his criticism of Walt, stepped forward. His face was etched with a mixture of regret and resolution. Extending his hand, he said, "I think I might have been wrong about you, Walt. Maybe you're not the man I thought you were." Walt hesitated, his instinct to retreat warring with the faint hope flickering inside him. Finally, he reached out and shook the man's hand. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of walls beginning to crumble. As the evening wore on, the tension that had hung over the room dissipated. People approached Walt, some to thank him for his work at the center, others to share their own stories of loss and redemption. Walt responded simply, with nods and brief words, but his gratitude was evident in the way he stood a little taller, his shoulders less burdened. Toward the end of the night, as the crowd began to thin, Amara approached him. "Did I do okay?" she asked, her eyes searching his face. Walt knelt down slightly, bringing himself to her level. "You did more than okay," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You did something I didn't think was possible." Amara tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "What's that?" "You gave me a second chance," he said simply, "and I'll never forget it." The exhibition concluded with a sense of renewal. It wasn't just a showcase of art, it was a celebration of growth, of the possibility that even the most broken among them could find a way to heal. Walt left the center that night with a quiet determination in his heart. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time, he felt like he wasn't walking it alone. The Brightwater Community Center buzzed with excitement as final preparations for the town's annual festival were underway. Stalls lined the streets outside, offering everything from handcrafted trinkets to homemade pastries, while the faint sound of a local band rehearsing drifted through the air. This year, the centerpiece of the festival wasn't just the food or the music, it was the art class organized by Seaside Care. At the center of it all was Walt Harrington. When Elena Morales first approached him with the idea, Walt had balked. "You want me to teach?" he had asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. "You're out of your mind." Eleanor's response had been patient but firm. "It's not about teaching. It's about showing who you are now, Walt. You've come so far. This is your chance to share that with the community." Walt had resisted, reluctant to put himself in such a vulnerable position. But then Amara had chimed in, her voice soft yet resolute. "If you don't try, how will you know what you're capable of?" Jaden, never one to pass up a chance to tease, had added with a grin, "Yeah, Mr. Harrington. What's the worst that could happen? Someone smudges their painting?" Despite his reservations, Walt found himself agreeing. And now, as he stood in the corner of the festival grounds, surrounded by easels and eager faces, he wondered if he had made a mistake. The children gathered for the class were a mix of Seaside Care attendees and other young residents of Brightwater. Amara and Jaden sat in the front row, their presence a source of both comfort and pressure. Walt cleared his throat, unsure how to begin. "All right," he said gruffly, his voice carrying over the soft hum of the crowd. "Today, we're going to paint something simple but meaningful." He turned to the easel he had set up earlier and revealed a painting he had worked on the night before. It depicted a shoreline bathed in golden light, the sun breaking through dark clouds to illuminate the waves. The scene was both serene and powerful, a testament to the beauty that could emerge even after a storm. "This," Walt said, gesturing to the painting, "is about hope, about finding light, even when everything feels dark." The children leaned in, their curiosity piqued. Walt handed out brushes and paints, guiding them through the process, step by step. To his surprise, the nervousness he had felt earlier began to fade. As the class progressed, he found himself engaging more, offering tips, praising the kids' efforts, and even cracking the occasional joke. The laughter that followed felt genuine, a sound he hadn't realized he missed. Amara and Jaden worked side by side, their paintings taking shape with every careful stroke. Amara's canvas featured a field of sunflowers, their bright faces turned toward a radiant sun. Jaden's was more abstract, bold streaks of color that seemed to vibrate with energy. Walt moved between the easels, offering encouragement and gentle corrections. With each interaction, the barrier between him and the community began to dissolve. As the class drew to a close, the crowd that had gathered to watch began to applaud. Walt turned, startled by the sound, and saw not just parents and children, but townsfolk who had once regarded him with suspicion. Their expressions were different now, softer, more open. One man who had been vocal in his criticism of Walt stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "I didn't think I'd ever see the day," the man said with a wry smile. "But you've proven me wrong, Harrington." Walt shook his hand, his grip firm but unassuming. "Just trying to do better," he replied simply. As the festival continued, Amara approached Walt with a bundle wrapped in brown paper. "This is for you," she said, her voice warm. Walt unwrapped the package to reveal a painting. It showed him standing between Amara and Jaden, their faces lit with joy. Above them, a banner of clouds parted to reveal a bright, open sky. At the bottom of the painting were the words, "Everyone deserves a second chance." For a moment, Walt couldn't speak. His throat tightened, and his eyes burned with unshed tears. He looked at Amara, then at Jaden, and finally at the crowd milling around them. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more than I can say." Amara smiled. "You've earned it." The festival culminated in a collaborative project, a large canvas where anyone could add their own brushstroke. Walt, Amara, and Jaden worked together to create the foundation, a vibrant depiction of Brightwater's shoreline, surrounded by symbols of growth and renewal. As the townsfolk added their contributions, the painting became a patchwork of stories, a testament to the power of community. When it was finished, Walt stepped back, taking in the completed piece. It was messy in places, imperfect, but undeniably beautiful. He turned to the crowd, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "I can't change the past," he began, his voice steady. "And I know I've caused pain. But what I've learned, what you've all shown me, is that it's never too late to try to be better. This painting, it's not just about me or any one person. It's about all of us, about the choices we make to come together, to forgive, and to build something worth holding on to." The applause that followed was loud and sustained, but what stayed with Walt was the warmth in the eyes of those around him. As the sun set over Brightwater, casting the festival in a golden glow, he felt a quiet sense of peace. The journey wasn't over. There was still work to be done, wounds to heal. But for the first time, Walt believed in the possibility of a future filled with light. This story reminds us of the incredible power of compassion and the courage it takes to change. At its core, it's a testament to humanity's ability to grow, to heal, and to reach out even when bridges feel irreparably burned. True transformation is not about erasing the past. It's about taking accountability and using those lessons to create a better future, not just for ourselves, but for everyone we touch. In a world often divided by misunderstanding and judgment, stories like this encourage us to choose empathy over hostility and action over apathy. They remind us that kindness is not a grand gesture, but a series of small, consistent acts that have the power to ripple outward, impacting others in ways we may never fully realize. And perhaps most importantly, they show that forgiveness, whether given or received, can be a powerful force for good. What are your thoughts on the message of this story? How do you believe communities can come together to foster understanding and acceptance? We'd love to hear your insights in the comments. Let's spark a conversation about the ways we can build bridges instead of walls. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring and heartfelt tales. Together, let's keep sharing and spreading stories that uplift, connect, and remind us of the best in humanity. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.